Good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle. I hope you're doing well, and welcome to episode 23 of Crime Story Sunday. And today we're exploring one of the oldest cases I've covered in this series. I think it's possibly the oldest case I've covered in Crime Story Sunday. And we're heading to 1828, and our location is Edinburgh, the capital city of Scotland. The Burke and Hare murders were a series of 16 killings committed over a period of only 10 months. William Burke and William Hare sold the bodies of the people that they murdered to an esteemed anatomist called Robert Knox for dissection at his anatomy lectures. It seems like alien today, but in those days they didn't have computers. Everything that they learnt about the human body came from actually dissecting. And Burke and Hare were paid well for their crimes. Indeed, Edinburgh was a leading light in the whole of Europe for anatomical study in the early 19th century. But the demand for appropriate, freshly deceased cadavers led to a shortfall in legal supply. Scottish law required that corpses used for medical research and for lecturing purposes should only come from those who had died in prison, suicide victims, and for child corpses, because children needed to be studied as well, from foundlings and orphans. So, in short, those without parents or other caregivers. This shortage for corpses led to an increase in body snatching or grave robbing by chillingly what were known as resurrection men. And they'd literally go in the dead of night and dig up freshly deceased bodies from their graves. Disturbing a grave was a criminal offence, but it was confusing because although taking property from the deceased was a crime, taking the body itself was not an offence because it didn't legally belong to anyone. I'm sure they could have made that situation simpler, but who am I to question what was law in Scotland in 1828? But this shortfall for legal cadavers, for anatomical study, medical research, etc., the situation got so bad that by the 1820s, the residents of Edinburgh had taken to the streets in protest at the increase in grave robbing, because Edinburgh was such a leading light in this field of study. Universities had started to turn a blind eye to exactly where these fresh cadavers were coming from, and this was part of the problem with the Burke and Hare murders. Bereaved families used several techniques in order to deter thieves from stealing the bodies of their recently deceased loved ones. In some cases, guards were hired to watch graves. Watchtowers were built in several cemeteries across Edinburgh. Some families deployed large stone slabs that could be placed over a grave for a short period until the body had begun to decay. And at that point, it was no longer useful. So what grave robbers were looking for were graves that had very recently been dug. So literally, they needed them within days of them being interred into their gravesite. The richer families even went so far as to use iron cages that surrounded the coffin. They were just so desperate. They just didn't want their loved ones stolen. So the high level of vigilance from the public and these various techniques used to deter grave robbers led to a crisis for available bodies. The situation was going from bad to worse. And Burke and Hare capitalised on this. But instead of digging up the dead and, getting their hands dirty in the graves of the recently deceased, they got their hands dirty in a different way, because they accepted lucrative incentives to end the lives of the living. So it's now time. Let's do it. Let's get into the story. So we'll start with who were these dreadful people. Let's start with Robert Knox. He qualified as a doctor in 1814, and after several years as a war physician, in 1820 he settled back to his hometown of Edinburgh. And he was at the beginning of a potentially illustrious career. In 1825, he became a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons, where he lectured on anatomy. He undertook dissections twice a day, so he needed 2 bodies a day. And his advertising promised, and I quote, a full demonstration on fresh anatomical subjects as part of every course of lectures. He built up a great reputation as a teacher and lecturer, and almost single-handedly, even though he was fairly early on in his career, raised the profile of the study of anatomy in Britain. However, to stay on top of his game and improve even more, he needed a continual supply of dead bodies. William Burke was born in 1792 in County Tyrone in Ireland. One of 2 sons born to middle-class parents. Burke, along with his brother Constantine, had a comfortable upbringing and both joined the British Army as teenagers. Burke served in the Donegal militia until he met and married a woman from County Mayo, where they later settled for a time. This marriage, however, was short-lived, and in 1818, after an argument with his father-in-law over land ownership, Burke deserted his wife and family, and he got on a boat and he moved to Bonnie, Scotland. He made money at first by becoming a labourer working on the Union Canal. He settled in a village near Falkirk and set up home with someone called Helen MacDougall, who became his second wife and a possible accomplice in the crimes that were to come. In November 1827, when the works on the Union Canal were finished, the couple moved to Edinburgh. They became hawkers, which was selling second-hand clothes to impoverished locals. Burke then, he became a cobbler, almost like a shoemaker, a trade in which he experienced some success, and he set his own little business, and he was earning up to £1 a week, or about £100 in today's money. He became known locally as an industrious and good-humoured man who often entertained his clients by singing and dancing to them whilst on their doorsteps plying his trade, whilst mending their shoes. Now let's turn to William Hare, and there's actually a lot less known about this guy. He was born in Ireland, but the exact location and the year of his birth and basically anything about his early life was unknown. Like Burke, he moved to Scotland to work on the Union Canal for a few years before moving to Edinburgh in the mid-1820s, where he worked as a coalman's assistant, carrying coal, moving coal from one location to another. He lodged at a house in Tanner's Close, and this was a lodging house run by a man called Logue and his wife Margaret. Logue died, however, in 1826, and William Hare married the widow Margaret and took over the running of the lodging house. So he literally kind of just took on Logue's life. Burke and MacDougall met her sometime in 1827 when they all followed work for a summer to a place called Midlothian to work on the harvest. It was easy money. Farmers just needed workers in the fields harvesting crops. It was easy money for hard workers. Burke and Hare became friends, and when Burke and MacDougall returned to Edinburgh, they moved into Hare's Tanner's Close lodging house. And Burke and Hare soon acquired a reputation for hard drinking and boisterous behaviour. They worked hard, but they also played even harder. So those are the players. in this sordid, horrible story, let's get into the murders themselves. 29th of November, 1827 is when this sorry tale starts. And someone called Donald, a lodger in Hare's house, died. Burke and Hare decided to make a quick buck and sell Donald's body to one of the local anatomists who they'd heard paid a lot of money for them. I mean, this wasn't a murder. This was someone who'd actually died of a disease, and they just capitalised on it. A carpenter provided a coffin for the burial, which was paid for by the local parish because this guy Donald didn't have any money, didn't have any family, no one would miss him. So after the carpenter left, the pair opened the coffin, removed the body, which they hid under the bed, filled the coffin with bark from the local tanners and resealed it. So after the coffin had been removed for burial, they took the body from under the bed and they took it to Edinburgh University, where they looked for a purchaser. I mean, they just walked in to a university building with a dead body. A student pointed them in the direction of Knox. Knox bought this dead body of Donald for £7.10, which is about £720 in today's money. So, not a bad little earner. According to Burke's official confession a few months later, as he and Hare left the university, one of Knox's assistants told them that the anatomists would be glad to see them again when they had another to dispose of. This gave Burke and Hare the idea that they could make really easy money by preying on the vulnerable, those who, didn't really have anyone that would miss them, by murdering them and selling their bodies to Robert Knox, who, it appears, didn't ask too many questions. The first murder in January or February of 1828 was either that of a miller named Joseph lodging in Hare's house, or a salt seller named Abigail Simpson. We'll take Joseph first. It was probably Joseph who was murdered first. He developed a fever and had become delirious, so he actually wasn't questioned when he died. Hare and his wife had been concerned that having this potentially infectious lodger would be bad for business, so they wanted to get rid of him quick smart. So Hare and Burke colluded and decided to ply their victim with whiskey so that he was barely conscious, and Hare suffocated him while Burke lay across the upper torso to restrict any movement. Possibly he was too out of it on whiskey to put up too much of a fight, but anyway. And again, they took the corpse to Knox, who this time paid them a handsome fee of £10, or about £1,000 in today's money. Now, Abigail Simpson was a pensioner who lived in the nearby village of Gilmerton, and she visited Edinburgh to supplement her pension by selling salt. On the 12th of February 1828, and this is the only exact date we have for any of these murders. I don't know why Burke remembered this above any other, but she was invited to Hare's lodging house to drink, and she was plied with enough alcohol to ensure she was too drunk to return home. And same thing, suffocated her. And after her, an English male lodger who was staying in Edinburgh from Cheshire. It's not far from where I live. The unnamed Englishman, don't know who this guy was a travelling seller of matches and tinder who fell ill with jaundice at Hare's lodging house. And again, as with Joseph, Hare and his wife were concerned about the effect of having an ill lodger might have on their business. So, they had to get rid of him as well. For both of those bodies, they received £10, £1,000 each. So this really is a nice little earner. Dr. Knox approved of the bodies being so fresh. They were the perfect specimens Just didn't ask any questions. Then, February or March, the next victim, again unnamed, invited to the house by Margaret, given enough whiskey to fall asleep, and then suffocated and sold to Robert Knox for another £10. Then, sometime in spring, most probably early April, Burke met two women, Mary Patterson and Janet Brown, in a tavern, like drinking together in a tavern. The three of them left the tavern with 2 bottles of whiskey, and instead of going straight home, they went to his brother Constantine's house. I don't know why. After Constantine left for work, Burke and the 2 women finished the whiskey. Patterson fell asleep at the table. Burke and Brown continued talking, but were interrupted by Helen McDougall, who accused them of having an affair. A row broke out between Burke and McDougall, during which time he threw a glass at Janet Brown, cutting her over the eye. Brown stated that she didn't know Burke was married and left. Maybe that's why Burke took the women to his brother's house. Maybe he did intend to have his way. Who knows? Who knows? Anyway, McDougall also left and went to fetch Hare and his wife. They arrived shortly afterwards, and the 2 men locked the wives out of the room and murdered Patterson as she slept at the kitchen table. They just murdered her where she slept. That afternoon, the pair took the body to Knox in a tea chest. They were paid £8, or about £800, for this particular corpse, which was still warm when they delivered it to Knox. But one of Knox's assistants did ask them as they were leaving where they found this body, where they got this body from, because he thought he recognised her. Burke explained that the woman had just drunk herself to death and they'd purchased it from an old woman. Okay. So no further questions were asked about that. Janet Brown came back to look for her friend, but she was told that her friend had left. She'd already left. And, she'd run off with a travelling salesman. They'd eloped to Glasgow. So that was that. Instead, she was awaiting dissection at Edinburgh University. But Janet Brown wasn't to know that, was she? Now, we're getting to kind of mid-1828 now. So the middle of the summer, 1828. Someone called Mrs. Haldane, who Burke described as a stout old woman, lodged at Hare's lodging house. After she became drunk, she fell asleep in a stable and again suffocated and sold. Several months later, Haldane's daughter, someone called Margaret, also lodged at the lodging house. She and Burke drank together heavily, and then he killed her. Just killed her, just like that. Again, sold to Knox. Next murder occurred, again, the summer of 1828. This was an old woman who joined the house as a lodger. Was nobody questioning why people kept just disappearing from this lodging house? But then again, I suppose, people come and go from lodging houses all the time. It's like a motel or a hotel, isn't it? People might stay for a night or two and then they go, and I don't know. These people didn't have family, no one looking for them, or nothing. I don't know. Again, this woman, given whiskey, drunk herself into a stupor. Burke smothered her, and her body was sold to Knox. Then came the murder of someone called Effie, who was a cinder gatherer, who scavenged through bins and rubbish tips to sell what she found. Effie was known to Burke and had previously sold him scraps of leather for his cobbling business, so he knew her. Not a friend, but an acquaintance. But didn't matter to Burke, they just wanted the money. He tempted her into a stable with whiskey, and when she was drunk enough, he and her, again, killed her. £10 was given by Knox for Effie's body. And then came another victim, and they stole this person literally from the arms of a police officer. This was a woman. She was too drunk to stand. She was being helped along by the local constable back to her lodgings, and Burke said, "Oh, officer, I know who this woman is. I'll take her. I'm going that way." And the officer said, "Oh, right you are." And he took her back to the house, killed her, and sold her body to Knox. I mean, literally, this is how brazen they were. Literally out of the arms of a police officer. They were just preying on the people who were drunk, who were vulnerable. They were just getting more and more brazen and more rich, I suppose. Burke and Hare murdered 2 other lodgers. This was in June of 1828. And this one is horrible. This is an old woman and her grandson who had learning difficulties, and they were now preying on children. This was a young boy. His grandmother was murdered in the bedroom, and the little boy was out there kind of playing in the kitchen. Burke and Hare came into the kitchen, picked up the little boy, took him into the bedroom and killed him as well. And Burke later said in this confession that he made that this was the murder that disturbed him the most, as he was haunted by his recollection of the boy's expression as he was dying. Now, on 24th of June 1828, Burke and MacDougall departed for a holiday to Falkirk to visit MacDougall's elderly father. Burke knew that Hare was short of cash and had even pawned some of his clothes. I mean, why? How was he short of cash? What were they spending it all on? Hare was running a lodging business and he was getting all of this money on the side. Why was he short of money? But anyway, that's an aside. But when the couple returned from seeing MacDougall's father, Hare was wearing new clothes and had money in his pockets. So after he was asked, have you murdered anyone? Where have you got this money from? Hare denied that he'd sold another body, when in fact he had, because Burke checked with Knox, who confirmed that Hare had sold a woman's body to him for £8. This led to an almighty argument between the two men, so much so that they came to blows. They were done. And Burke moved in with his cousin, someone called John Brogan, 2 streets away from Tanner's Close. However, the breach between the two friends didn't last long. In late September or early October, Hare was visiting Burke when someone called Mrs. Ostler, a washerwoman, came to the property to do the laundry. And they were back to their old ways. The men got her drunk and just murdered her, suffocated her, and by the afternoon, that body was there with Knox, ready for dissection. As I said, these guys were getting so brazen. Only a week or 2 after that, one of Helen MacDougall's relatives, someone called Anne MacDougall, was visiting from Falkirk, and after a few days, they killed her as well and received £10 for her body. This is one of Ellen MacDougall's relatives. They're now starting to murder their own relatives, or at least his wife's relatives. Burke and Hare's next victim was a familiar figure along the streets of Edinburgh, and this was someone called James Wilson. And this was just an 18-year-old young man with a limp due to having been born with deformed feet. He was also mentally challenged, but people were fond of him. They fondly called him Daft Jamie. People, would stop and chat with him, give him money, buy him food, just basically look out for Daft Jimmy. A lot of people knew him. And this really was the beginning of the end for the murderous duo. Not that they cared that they were killing somebody that, a lot of people knew. They just saw him as this mentally disabled boy that perhaps, didn't have any family. But anyway, they lured Jamie Wilson into a bedroom at the lodging house, plied him with whiskey and murdered him. But when the body was examined the following day by Knox and his students, not just one, but several of them recognised him and knew him. They knew him. Knox denied. Said, no, you can't possibly know who this is. And they were like, it's Daft Jimmy. It's Daft Jimmy. We know him. But he was like, no. But when the word started circulating that James Wilson was actually missing, Knox dissected the body quick smart, without the head. And the feet, the deformed feet, were removed before the main dissection. Now, for me, that shows Knox knew. He knew that these bodies were coming to him. He was paying for them illegally by nefarious means. He knew that these bodies, this continual stream of bodies that Burke and Hare were giving him, still warm, things were starting to get really sloppy for them. But the final victim was someone called Margaret Doherty, a middle-aged Irish woman. Burke lured her into the Brogan lodgings, so his cousin's lodging house, by claiming that his mother was also a Doherty from the same area of Ireland. The pair began drinking. At one point, Burke left Doherty in the company of Ellen McDougall while he went out to buy more whiskey. Actually, not only had he gone to buy more whiskey, he'd gone to get her to assist him with this murder. They weren't at home. They weren't on their own turf here. They were at Brogan's place. And there were two other lodgers, Anne and James Gray, who were there at the same time. And Anne and James Gray were a bit of an inconvenience. So they paid them to stay at Hare's lodgings for the night, claiming that Doherty was a relative. And they wanted to, spend a night with this relative. Odd excuse. But anyway, the Grays went with it. And the drinking continued into the evening, at which time, they were all pretty drunk. They almost get caught. Because about 9 p.m, the Greys returned briefly to collect some clothing for their children. And they saw Burke, Hare, both of their wives, and Doherty all drunk, singing and dancing. Shortly after that, Hare and Burke were so drunk they came to blows. They started arguing, but eventually they murdered Doherty, put her body in a pile of straw at the end of the bed. What? It was too late. By the time, the revelry had stopped and they'd stopped fighting, as I said, they were getting really sloppy. It was too late to take this body to the university. So they thought, well, we'll take it in the morning. So cover it up with straw. We'll deal with it tomorrow when we're sober. However, the next day, the Greys returned early. And Anne Gray became suspicious. Mrs. Gray, Anne Gray, said, I just need to go and get some things from that room. And Burke said, no, go somewhere. No, you can't go in there. Don't go in there yet. But Anne Gray was too suspicious. And she took James. They went and searched, and they found Doherty's body. So they went to alert the police. Now, on their way to alert the police, they ran into Helen McDougall, who tried to bribe them with an offer of £10 a week if they kept their silence, but they refused. They were shocked. They knew this was a murder. Things were just too suspicious. So they reported the murder to the police, but by the time the police arrived, Burke and Hare had removed the body and were on the way to Knox's surgery to drop it off at the university. However, a police search located Doherty's clothing hidden under the bed. They just not had a chance or didn't even think about removing Doherty's clothing. When questioned, Burke and his wife claimed that Doherty had left the house but gave different times for her departure. This raised enough suspicion for the police to take them in for questioning. Early the following morning, the police went to Knox's dissecting rooms where they found Doherty's body. James Gray identified her as the woman that they'd seen with Burke and Hare and the woman that they found dead, hidden under straw in Brogan's lodging house. So on 3rd of November 1828, a warrant was issued for the detention of Burke, Hare, both of their wives, and also Brogan, because it was his house that the body of Doherty had been found. After some questioning, Brogan was let go. It was realised he didn't know anything. He was as shocked as anybody else. So he was released without further action. But the 4 suspects, Burke, Hare and their 2 wives, were all kept apart and statements taken. What they said, the stories they gave, were conflicting, which made cops even more sure that they were talking with the killers, that this was a murder and these guys were very badly trying to cover it up. They brought in someone called Alexander Black, who was a police surgeon. He examined Doherty's body, and 2 forensic specialists were also appointed, Robert Christiansen and William Newbigging. They reported that it was probable that the victim, Doherty, had been murdered by suffocation, but this couldn't be medically proven. But we know that was their modus operandi. So actually, the autopsy and the opinions of these forensic specialists did turn out to be right. On the basis of their report by these 2 forensic specialists, the Burkes and the Hares were all charged with murder. As part of this investigation, Knox was also interviewed. He asserted, though, that Burke and Hare were giving him bodies that he thought were, these were just people who legitimately were dying. Burke and Hare, they knew people, they were watching poor lodging houses, and they were purchasing bodies before anybody claimed them for burials. So what was the problem? Although Robert Knox was considered very unethical, it wasn't deemed that he'd actually broken the law, and he wasn't questioned any further. So they focused on the Burkes and the Hares. So although the police were sure that murder had taken place and that at least one of the 4 was guilty, they were uncertain whether they could ensure a conviction of all 4 of them. And because they weren't sure who'd actually done the killing, and they were just being given all of these conflicting stories, they decided to get a little bit clever here, because the police suspected that it wasn't just Doherty these 2 couples were guilty of murdering. They were sure that there was plenty more, but the lack of bodies, because these bodies had been dissected, right, at the anatomy schools. So even though the police suspected that there was many more victims, they couldn't prove it. There was a real threat that all 4 of them was going to get away with it. So they decided to play it cool. Someone called Sir William Ray, who was the Lord Advocate of Edinburgh, followed a regular technique, and he focused on one individual to extract confession on which the others could be convicted. Hare was chosen, and on the 1st of December, he was offered immunity from prosecution if he turned police informant, and he agreed. He agreed to save his own skin and basically tell all. Now, because he couldn't testify against his own wife, she was also exempt from prosecution. So that's 2 of the 4 who are now exempt from prosecution. Hare made a full confession of Doherty. He said it was Burke. Burke did it. And he also confessed as to knowing what happened to 2 other murders that the police had questioned him on. And that's all the police could really handle. They knew there was many more victims, but they just didn't know the names. Some of the names just haven't come down to us from history. They didn't know them then. We don't know them now. So Ray decided there was sufficient evidence to secure a prosecution. On 4th of December, formal charges were laid against Burke and his wife, MacDougall, for the murders of Mary Patterson, James Wilson, and Mrs. Doherty. Knox faced no charges, neither did Hare or his wife. So the full force of the law was focused on William Burke and Helen MacDougall. Public awareness of the news grew as newspapers began releasing detail after detail, getting more and more salacious. Public opinion was against Knox. Knox's reputation hit the floor. Many in Edinburgh thought he, Dr. Knox, was the sinister ringmaster. And, he'd been paying Burke and Hare to murder people. Now, that wasn't quite true. He just wasn't asking any questions. He was just paying quite handsomely for these still warm, freshly deceased bodies so that he can continue to grow his career in anatomical study and medical research. And a rhyme began circulating around the streets of Edinburgh. Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief, Knox the boy that buys the beef. So, the trial for the murder of Doherty, this was the case that they had the strongest evidence for, because they actually had a body, began at 10 a.m. on Christmas Eve. Why would you begin a trial on Christmas Eve? But anyway, it began 10 a.m. on Christmas Eve, 1828, before the High Court of Judiciary in Edinburgh's Parliament House. The case was heard by Lord Justice Clerk David Boyle. The court was full, even though it was Christmas Eve. People were preparing for Christmas. This was sensationalism at its very best. And the court was full. I mean, they opened the doors at 9 a.m. and there was large crowds gathering outside Parliament House. 300 police constables had to be on duty to prevent disturbances, to prevent riots. People were trying their best to get a seat in this courtroom. And if the ranks of the 300 constables had been breached, they actually had the army on standby with cavalry, just in case there was a stampede and the streets were overrun by people who were clamouring to get a glimpse of this trial. This was the trial of the century. The case ran all through the day and all through the night. Why? They didn't take a break for Christmas Day? But no, they didn't. Burke and MacDougall pled not guilty to the murder of Doherty. The first witnesses were called from a list of 55 that included Hare and Knox. Not all of the witnesses on the list were called, and Knox and 3 of his assistants avoided being questioned in court, so they obviously had friends in high places. One of Knox's assistants, however, someone called David Patterson, who had been the main person Burke and Hare had dealt with in Knox's surgery, was called and confirmed the pair had supplied the doctors with several corpses. In the early evening, Hare took the stand to give evidence. Under cross-examination about the murder of Doherty, Hare claimed Burke had been the one and sole murderer, and MacDougall had only twice been involved by bringing Doherty back to the house after she'd run away. That was her only involvement, according to Hare. Hare stated that he had assisted Burke in the delivery of the body to Knox, but he didn't have anything to do with the murder. But remember, he was immune anyway. After Hare's questioning, his wife entered the witness box carrying their baby daughter, who had developed whooping cough. Margaret used the child's coughing fits as a way to give herself thinking time for some of the questions, and told the court that she had very poor memory. She just had a baby, her baby was sick, and she really couldn't remember very many of the events, and I guess they believed her. She was concerned. She didn't want to implicate herself in this, did she? Now, the jury retired to consider its verdict at 8:30 a.m. on Christmas Day. So they'd gone all through Christmas Eve, all through the night. It only took them 50 minutes. Only 50 minutes, because they wanted to get home to have Christmas, surely. 50 minutes later, they delivered a guilty verdict against Burke for the murder of Doherty. However, they found that the case against MacDougall was not proven. As he passed the death sentence against Burke, Justice Boyle told him, "Your body should be publicly dissected, and I trust that if it were ever customary to preserve skeletons, yours will be preserved, in order that posterity will keep in remembrance your atrocious crimes." MacDougall was released at the end of the trial and returned home. The following day, she went to buy whiskey and was confronted by a mob who were angry at the not proven verdict. She was taken to a police building for her own protection, but the mob laid siege on the police station. They were so angry. She escaped through a back window. She tried to get to see Burke before she left, but they wouldn't let her in, so she basically just disappeared. She left Edinburgh, and there's no further accounts of what she did with the rest of her life. She got away. She wasn't part of the murders, but she knew, she was an accomplice of sorts. So, they're not guilty of murder verdict, I guess was the right one. But anyway, on 3rd of January 1829, on the advice of both Catholic priests and Presbyterian clergy, Burke made a complete confession. And this is where we know so many details of all of the murders. I mean, Burke knew he was going to die, thought God was going to be very angry with him, and he needed to confess all of his sins. There was way more details than the police knew about. Hare only, even though he was granted immunity from prosecution, he only gave them the bare bones. That he only answered their questions. He didn't proffer them confessions about any of the victims that they just didn't know about. But it was shocking. So even more salacious details came out in the press. Then on the 16th of January 1829, a petition on behalf of James Wilson's mother and sister, protesting against Hare's immunity from prosecution and intended release from prison, was given lengthy consideration by the High Court, but rejected by a vote of 4-2. Margaret was released on the 19th of January and travelled to Glasgow to find a passage back to Ireland. While waiting for a ship, she was recognised and attacked by an angry mob. She was given shelter in a police station before given a police escort onto a Belfast-bound vessel. And there's no more accounts of what she did with the rest of her life. Burke was hanged on the morning of the 28th of January, 1829, in front of a crowd possibly as large as 25,000 people. Views from windows in the tenement blocks overlooking the scaffold were hired at prices ranging from 5 shillings to 20 shillings, depending on the quality of the view available. On the 1st of February, Burke's corpse was publicly dissected by someone called Professor Monroe. Police had to be called when a large number of students gathered demanding access to the lectures, which there'd been a limited number of tickets sold. A riot ensued. Calm was only restored after one of the university professors negotiated with the crowd that they would be allowed to pass through the lecture theatre in batches of 50 after the dissection to look at Burke's dissected body. During the procedure, which lasted for 2 hours, Monroe dipped his quill into Burke's blood and wrote, "This is written with the blood of William Burke, who was hanged at Edinburgh. The blood was taken from his head." Burke's skeleton was given to the Anatomy Museum of the Edinburgh Medical School, where as of 2022, it still remains. The judge's request was well and truly honoured, and you can say that William Burke well and truly got his comeuppance for his crimes. However, not so for William Hare, who, as we recall, was immune from prosecution. He was still in prison at this point, but he was released on the 5th of February 1829. His extended stay wasn't because he was going to be on trial for anything. It was at his request and undertaken for his own protection. He wanted to stay in prison until all of the drama had died down. He was assisted in leaving Edinburgh in disguise by the mail coach to Dumfries. But at one of his stops, he was recognised by a fellow passenger, someone called Erskine Douglas Sandford, a junior counsel who had represented James Wilson's family. Sandford informed his fellow passengers of Hare's identity. On arrival at Dumfries, the news of Hare's presence spread, and a large crowd of angry people gathered. Police arrived and arranged for a decoy coach to draw off the crowd, while Hare escaped through a back window and into a carriage that took him to the town's prison for safekeeping. So he went back to prison for his own safekeeping. A crowd surrounded the prison building. Stones were thrown at the doors and the windows. Street lamps were smashed. People rioted throughout the streets. 100 extra special constables arrived to restore order. In the small hours of the morning, as the crowd died down, escorted by a sheriff officer and militia guard, William Hare was taken out of the town and instructed to make his way to the English border. And yet again, as with the women who went before, we don't know what happened next. It's like this horrible, dreadful, dramatic tale just ends. It's like when you get to the end of a book and the last chapter has been torn out. That's how it feels. We don't know what happened to him. Did he make it to England? Did people recognise him? Was he murdered? What happened to him? We don't know. And we'll never know. Robert Knox, however, our medic, or anatomist, he refused to make any public statements about his dealings with Burke and Hare. The common thought in Edinburgh, as I said before, was that he was culpable in the events, and some even said he was the evil ringmaster. He was lampooned in caricature in the papers. And in February 1829, a crowd gathered outside of his house and burnt an effigy of him. In fear for his own safety, and I guess that his colleagues weren't too happy working with him, he resigned from his position as curator of the College of Surgeons Museum, and he was gradually excluded from university life altogether by his peers. He left Edinburgh in 1842, lectured in England for a while, went to mainland Europe and lectured there. While working in London, he fell foul of regulations of the Royal College of Surgeons. Surprise, surprise, not following the rules, and he was debarred. I think they were probably just looking for an excuse. He was sacked, he was debarred from lecturing, he was removed from the Roll of Fellows of the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 1848. From 1856, he worked as a pathologist and anatomist at the Brampton Cancer Hospital and had a medical practice in Hackney in London until his death in 1862. So although he didn't get the illustrious career, he kept a job, he kept a roof over his head, and at least we know what happened to him. But the rest of them, riots in the streets, being squirreled away at the dead of night, and then nothing. We don't know. We don't know where they are. But isn't that just a shocking tale? It's got everything. It's a story with everything. Murder, drama, disgust, body snatching. It's unbelievable. We just need zombies and the whole tale would be complete. But anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. I've been Michelle. I hope you're well. I'll see you in the next video. I'll see you very soon for episode 24 of Crime Stories Sunday. Bye for now, guys.